You're watching Reality Check. Now, on Monday, we had reported on how the budget had ignored the bad news in current updated economic data called the provisional actuals and instead used older data known as revised estimates to paint a rosier picture. The difference was huge. The updated numbers which the economic survey chose to use showed a rupees 1.7 lakh crore drop in the government's earnings last year compared to the numbers cited in the budget. Now, the finance minister had a chance to respond to this in her reply to the budget, but she ducked responding to why they ignored this massive piece of bad news, even though they had the information. Now, in fact, a closer examination of the budget numbers shows that the government has indirectly acknowledged the bad news in the updated data in what is called the provisional actuals by significantly scaling down the projected earnings between the interim budget in February and the full budget which was presented in July. My colleague Mariam Alvi has been crunching the numbers, and what have you found, Mariam?
So, Vasu, in the interim budget, the government had projected gross tax revenues of about 25.5 lakh crores, while in the full budget that just came out this month, they scaled this down to about 24.6 lakh crore. That's a big drop of around 90,000 crore, which comes to 0.4% of the GDP.
Okay, hold on. That's just, sorry. So that's the big breaking headline coming out of the deep dive, that actually the government then has acknowledged the bad news silently though, and that's reflected in the fact that they've downscaled the revenue or the tax projections by 90,000 crore rupees between February and July. Sorry, go ahead.
So, exactly, Vasu. So, the question we need to be asking is that what information would the government have received between February, when the interim budget was presented, and July, when we now have the full budget, that they had to significantly scale down their revenue? Quite simply, this could be the provisional actuals that came out in May. If you remember from our Monday's episode, that if you look at the provisional actuals, the 2018-19 numbers were not looking that good. The government was expecting to earn much more, but they actually, their gross tax revenue was 1.7 lakh crore lower than what they had expected to earn when they were presenting the budget in February.
So, all right. So, what you're saying, Mariam, is that given the fact that the provisional actuals, the more accurate data came out between the interim budget and the actual budget, that's the information they got which has led them to scale down the tax projections by 90,000 crore rupees. So, they actually had access to that data. They had acknowledged it in their own way in the budget, but they didn't do so when it came to the overall, the big picture revenue projections and in terms of the expenditure projections. So, obviously, there was an attempt to sort of, in a sense, whatever the right word is, bury or bypass the bad news. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Vasu, I mean, that's sort of a fair assumption to make, because otherwise what explains this drop? And what we have shown you is just the drop in the gross tax revenue, which includes both the shares for the state and the centre. Now, if you look at just the impact this has on the centre alone, its tax revenue projections since February have also dropped, here by around 60,000 crore. And the total revenue projections have dropped by 20,000 crore. Now, oddly enough, even though the revenue has dropped between February and July, the new budget shows an increase in spending of around 10,000 crore. So, the government is planning to spend more while earning less.
Right. So, between February and July, they actually have upped the spending by 10,000 crores, even though they're actually earning less. In February, they're spending more in July. So, this is another sort of budget mystery math. Okay, thank you very much indeed, Mariam, for joining us. So, more evidence emerging that the government was privy to the quote-unquote bad news in the latest updated data, chose not to factor it into their budget calculations, but have done it in their own way when you look at how much they're actually projecting as a drop in their tax revenue. So, that's quite interesting, and that is quite significant. All right, let me now go across to my panel. I have Lalita Kumar Mangalam with me, who's joining us from the BJP. We have Professor Arun Kumar, economist, someone who's looked very closely, particularly at the black economy. We have Pooja Mehra here with us, of course, journalist and Amitabh Dubey, a political analyst, someone who's also with the Congress party. So, Pooja, I know we're all still scratching our heads and trying to get ourselves sort of acquainted with this continuing muddle of the budget's numbers. But again, I mean, broadly, this is all sort of suggesting what we and several others have been reporting since earlier this week, that the budget has really chosen to go down a path which has rarely been followed before. That you have access to updated data, you have access to much more current data, but you're going with earlier numbers because it's making your, the overall picture look better.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I also think that I do see a hint of the realization of the slowdown in tax collections, because the gaping hole because of the tax collection revenue is sought to be filled up in the budget that has just been presented through an increase in non-tax revenue estimates. So the finance minister proposes to raise 1.63 lakh crore as compared to 1.3 lakh crore estimated in February through dividends and profits from public sector enterprises.
Right.
And this includes an extraordinarily large dividend from the Reserve Bank of India of 90,000 crore, whereas in February the estimate was 68,000 crore. And similarly for disinvestment, in February Mr. Goyal had projected in the interim budget revenue estimates, non-tax revenue estimates of 90,000 crore. And now Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman has raised that to 1.5 lakh crore.
Right.
So,
what is in simple terms?
Yeah. So what this
this
means is that what they are clearly seeing will not come as tax revenue, which is the optimistic estimate that they had in February has been scaled down, and to make up for that lower revenue estimate, they are scaling up their estimate for non-tax
revenues. Right. Professor Arun Kumar, I mean, again, try to sort of put this in perspective for us, because here you have a government that has made much of the fact that because of, their crackdown against black money and all of that, there is greater tax compliance. There's been a big surge in tax collections. But here, you actually find that there's a 90,000 crore drop in their own projections from February to July. But again, the numbers have been sort of masked.
So, what happens is that the CAG looks at the accounts. It's the data given by the Ministry of Finance to the CAG, and then if there are any differences, there's a conference held, and after that conference the data is finalized. So in the first week of June, the CAG released its report showing that GST was short by about 1 lakh crores and the balance about 60,000 crores was short from direct taxes, and therefore the Ministry of Finance knew this data. Now why should they project data on the basis of the wrong revised estimates of February? We already know that the fiscal deficit in December was running at 120% of the annual target. So we know that the revenues were short as compared to the expenditures. And if you are going to maintain 3.4% of the fiscal deficit, then you have to cut expenditures. So where were the expenditures cut? That's the second part of the non-transparency. The first part of non-transparency is that you had revenue short. Second is that if you maintain the fiscal deficit, then the expenditures are short. And then the next year's data goes wrong because you project the next year's data on the basis of the revised estimates that you have from the budget. So if the revised estimates are wrong, then the estimates for next year go wrong.
No,
and
but
therefore,
here,
what is projected on the wrong.
I'm just interrupting you to say that it's a peculiar situation. I just want to quickly intervene to say it's a peculiar situation, because you're right to say that you're basing it on revised estimates which are clearly wrong. But on the other hand, you've also seen, quote unquote, the bad news in the provisional actuals, and that's why what we just reported, that between February and July, you had to sort of scale down your tax revenues, expectations by 90,000 crore rupees, which is 0.4% of the GDP.
I know.
So you're kind of
next
indirectly
year,
acknowledging
the projections
problem.
are very high because they were. No, but next year, that is for 2019-20, the projections are very high. You'd have to have almost a 20% increase in the revenue collection because of the incorrect projections. You know, because expenditures and revenues are projected on the basis of the figures that you have as revised estimates. So if the revised estimates are down by some like 1.6 lakh crores, then you have to make that up plus the additional amount of revenue that you are slating for. And then they've raised the rate of growth of the economy from 11.5% to 12%, whereas currently the rate of growth of the economy nominal is running at about 8.5%. So therefore, there's another non-transparency that has come in. Where do you get this 12% rate of growth? There's really no turnaround at the moment, given that the automobile sector, FMCG sector and other sectors are not doing well. So it's very unlikely that you're going to use go up to 12% unless the inflation rate kicks up. So there are several non-transparencies in this budget.
You know, Lalita Kumarmangalam again, and we were saying this, we're making this point on Monday as well, that for reasons that they know best, the opposition has not made this into a big issue. They have not really politically challenged the government. But were they to do that, we still have not got clear answers, Lalita Kumarmangalam, and I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible because it can get very technical, and you know, there are only very few of us here who are true experts on the economy on this panel. But you know, were the opposition to confront you, the explanation from the finance ministry or the finance minister, who had a chance to address some of this in a reply to the budget, has not come. And there are now some serious questions that are mounting on the data and the findings and the projections of this budget.
Vasu, let me say that it is, I mean, I don't think the purpose of this show is to discuss how worthy the opposition is or not. The questions they want to ask or don't want to ask is entirely up to them. Now, in her reply, when Ms. Sitharaman spoke, let us acknowledge one thing, that Nirmala Sitharaman is not a person to either exaggerate or fudge. She is normally quite to the point and very upfront. She has made it clear that the data that was given is factual, and that the budget deficit, that fiscal prudence will be followed. As you know, in the budget also there were several allocations made for various infrastructure spending, whether it was on water or on agriculture. They have talked about also, perhaps that's what their plan is, and I think it is, to in some ways increase consumer expenditure. And remember that the Indian economy is still largely a consumer economy.
But that's not,
especially when they talk about investing on you know, in women in various, I'm not just talking about the self-help groups, but generally investing in various ways on women. They've talked about increasing ICD's expenditure. All of this will have a sort of multiplier effect.
But Lalita Kumarmangalam, I appreciate
the excessive
I don't want to interrupt you.
Cynicism is
I don't
being
want to
shown in terms of you know.
I don't want to interrupt you. This is not really sort of questioning Ms. Sitharaman's integrity in that sense. But what has emerged, and this is not actually coming out from, in a sense, an external source. The government's own two hands, in a sense, are saying different things. So the economic survey has updated data which is actually showing a 1.73 lakh crore gap in how much the government actually earned last year compared to what the budget put out. And what many people are saying, and these are all, I would say, you know, bipartisan experts, is that this is just one of many several anomalies in the budget which has called all the numbers into question. And that Ms. Sitharaman frankly did not
Vasu,
directly
as you
address.
yourself have pointed out, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Vasu, as you yourself have pointed out a little while earlier, the budget has perhaps not overtly, but certainly, I mean, openly enough, taken cognizance of the fact that the revenue receipts are going to drop this year.
Right.
And 40,000 crores, sorry, 40,000 crores, which is what between 130 to 90 the difference is not that large a sum in terms of a budget that is as large as India's. Now, I am not trying to negate the importance of that 40,000 crores, But I am sure that the government has its own plans in place in order to be able to, like I said earlier, maintain fiscal prudence and try to keep inflation in check also.
Right.
Much of what the infrastructure spending that they have said they are going to spend on will probably kickstart the economy. Remember, they have spoken about Manrega, they spoke about water.
There are some questions about that as well.
The Prime Minister has made it clear that water is going to be on a war front like Swachh Bharat was.
So you're saying
that's obviously going to provide more jobs, more employment, perhaps on a smaller scale.
Okay, so you're saying that the government has factored this in.
Consumer expenditure.
Okay. Let me just go to Amitabh Dubey. Amitabh Dubey, somehow this does not seem to have become a political issue to the extent that the numbers seem to suggest. Why do you think that is?
Well, firstly, the opposition is busy with firefighting a few crises, as I'm sure your channel has covered.
I wonder what this could be.
I wonder what this could be.
Can't imagine.
But senior parliamentarians have spoken on the budget in Parliament and pointed out various criticisms of it. Jairam Ramesh, Shashi Tharoor, and others. Mr. Chidambaram, of course. I think and also it's an evolving story. These facts are now beginning to come out, and it's very clear that there are huge inconsistencies in this budget.
Yes.
And very often in every budget there is some element of window dressing to make the deficit look better, and so on and so forth.
Of course, yes, everybody does.
But in this budget, I feel that the level of fiction is higher than usual. If you compare the provisional actuals with the revised estimates, the economic survey for many years has looked at provisional actuals rather than revised estimates. There's always this gap. But this time the gap is gigantic compared with, I've actually looked at past budgets to see what the gap was.
Yes.
And I think one reason is the government is turning a blind eye to the fact that the economy, the bottom has fallen out of the economy very recently. Tax revenues, car sales, spending, consumer spending, savings of course has been declining. So I think they're sort of sticking their heads in the sand and hoping that this goes away, which obviously it won't.
Right.
And really, I think possibly one reason Ms. Sitaraman didn't mention any numbers in Parliament during a budget speech was because she didn't want to giving false numbers, because there's huge variation between what's going on and what she was talking about.
In fact, on the screen is a graph, Pooja, that because we were looking at previous examples at the gap between interim budgets and full budgets in terms of gross tax revenue. Is the gap always this large? And it's actually not. In 2009-10, it was 30,000 crores. In 2014-15, it was 20,000 crores minus. And this year, the gap is 90,000 crores.
It is an unusually large. It is an unusually large.
Everything
gap.
About this time,
it is an unusually large gap. But I'd say
can I just ask you again, because I feel that this can get too technical to the ordinary viewer who's trying to look at this and understand. Okay, fine. There's this huge gap in the numbers, but how does it impact me? So, how does something like this impact the Aam Aadmi or Aurat?
Sure. So, one thing I want to say that the government is not expecting a big surge in tax, because you're looking at absolute numbers, but if you look at the budget numbers for tax to GDP ratio, they are estimating for direct tax, indirect tax and gross tax for the tax to GDP ratio to go down vis-a-vis last year, the budget estimate for this year. So, they're not being that dishonest or over optimistic.
Okay.
So I'd give that to them. Of course, there's unusually large, gaps in the usual tricks, and the usual tricks have not been executed with the kind of finesse I am used to seeing, having seen so many budgets.
All right.
But
how does this going to impact?
Yes. Now what happens is that if a government begins to fall short of its estimates for tax fixed at the beginning of the year, and there are many expenditures that cannot midway be correct, and
it's spending of various ministries and when that happens in a year like this year, where you've had
not as fast, then
so that could be a problem.
It puts the economy into a sort of downward spiral.
Professor Arun Kumar, again, just to understand from you, in very simple terms, I request you to just break down for us how this is going to impact, if again, these anomalies are true, how is this going to impact the ordinary Indian citizen in this coming year?
Okay, so the first thing is that this budget is being presented in July, when you actually had the data of expenditures up to March. Usually the budget is presented in January end, February first week.
That's
you know, when you have data only till December. So
Yes.
there's no excuse for using the incorrect data for making projections for next year.
Yes.
Second is that there's a constitutional provision where the annual financial statement has to be approved under Article 112. Now that says that, you know, you must give the accurate figures. If you don't give the accurate figures, what is the parliament going to approve? So you'll have to present revised figures of the budget again to have the